Welcome Carolyn Seburn. Today. She'll be speaking about Species at Risk Conservation Action Plan with the agricultural sector. Carolyn, whenever you're ready, please go ahead.
All right, thanks very much, Ian, and it's nice to see a lot of faces that I recognize for sure. I'm just gonna turn off my camera and share my screen. There we go. Is everybody seeing the slides?
Yes, it's just not in presentation view mode.
Well, that's funny because it is on my screen, except that it's showing a Teams screen around it for some reason that I don't quite understand. Let me try to stop presenting, and it's weird. Oh, I know why it did that. Okay. No, that's the wrong one. Apologies, folks. It's because I opened it originally in Teams, so I think we're going to have to go this way. Okay, so today I'm going to be speaking with you about the Conservation Action Plan for Species at Risk that's been developed with the agriculture sector. And many of you I know are familiar with this plan and this process, but some of you will not be, so I'll give a little bit of background. And so today what I'd like to do is provide context for the Pan-Canadian approach, where this came from, what the agriculture sector initiative is, and an update on our progress in developing this plan, and talk a bit about how it fits into the broader constellation of initiatives around sustainable agriculture production, because as we all know, there's a whole lot of those out there. Part of that those broader initiatives are, for example, the new Global Biodiversity Framework, which was agreed to in December of 2022. And although the work that we've been undertaken with through the Priority Sectors Initiative, and particularly with the agriculture sector, predates the GBF. It was heartening to see that a lot of the targets that come out from the GBF are strongly related to the work that we've been doing with the agriculture sector. So it gives us a nice confirmation that we're talking about the right things and aiming in the right direction. So this comes out of an approach developed by federal, provincial, and territorial ministers for conservation, wildlife, and biodiversity, called the Pan-Canadian Approach to Transforming Species at Risk Conservation. And that comes from a recognition that the Species at Risk Act, while it's a very powerful tool and it accomplishes a lot, it's not doing everything that we need to do for species at risk, and that we needed a new approach that was more collaborative and multi-species and ecosystem based as a complement to the Species at Risk Act and the other acts that provinces and territories have. And the Pan-Canadian approach consists of three coordinated initiatives. So the priority species, which I like to describe as caribou, 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 sage-grouse, and wood bison. And those it's an initiative that deals with high-profile, for the most part, fairly widespread species that require a strong degree of collaboration between levels of government, and industry and local communities. The Priority Places Initiative, which includes 11 federal, provincial, territorial approved priority places and 15 community nominated priority places distributed across the country. And the Priority Sectors Initiative, where federal, provincial, and territorial governments agreed to work together with the agriculture, forest, and urban development sectors to co-create plans to align sector policy and practice for species at risk conservation. And although the pan-Canadian approach was initially negotiated and agreed to by federal, provincial, and territorial governments, we're now working at also integrating the needs of Indigenous governments as well. So here's a map of where the priority places are. The green ones are the government-nominated priority places, and the purple ones are the community-nominated priority places. You'll recognize a bunch of those places as being very important for conservation and biodiversity. And you can see that there are several of them across the Prairie provinces. And then the priority species, all of which will also be familiar to folks. And then we get to the priority sectors. And what's important to understand is that these three approaches need to work together. So we can't accomplish what we need to do just by working on priority species, and we can't recover all the species at risk just by working in priority places or just by working with the priority sectors. The intent is that sort of they're all coming at it from different angles and working together to accomplish as much as we can for as many species as we can. So the purpose of the Priority Sectors Initiative is to identify and prioritize opportunities for better conservation action with sector policy and practice in ways that benefit the species and sector sustainability, and to co-create action plans with other levels of government, with Indigenous people, industry, and stakeholders, to build a policy case for future shared investment and collaborative action with the priority sectors. And so collaboration across partners and stakeholders is essential for success, and identifying sort of how we can all work together and invest together to accomplish the outcomes that we reach or that we aim for. In addition, we need to be aware, of course, of the context of reconciliation and the importance that Canada as a whole, the federal government, other governments, communities need to place on treaty and Indigenous rights, the interest of Indigenous communities in agricultural landscapes in particular, in this case, and the federal commitment to reconciliation. So that's something that's been top of mind for us throughout the process. And additional context that we're working in is the importance of climate change and the various actions that the federal government is undertaking on climate change through Environment Canada, Nature Smart Climate Solutions Fund, through the Ag Canada's Agricultural Climate Solutions, and NRCan's 2 Billion Trees program. We also, of course, recognize that there's lots of other things going on in the agriculture sector, and we really need to be aware of those practical realities. These are businesses. People need to pay attention to their bottom line. They need to be aware of and respond to market fluctuations, both consumer and market requirements, and growing expectations. There's also a keen awareness of increasing climate risks, and this really came home to us as, over the course of the period of time that we were developing this plan, individuals and communities dealing with COVID, with floods, with droughts, with heat domes, etc., all of which have an impact on agriculture. But also the imperative to keep the land healthy for future generations, and lots of other realities out there that individual producers need to pay attention to. So the question we need to ask ourselves is, how do we enable and support producers to conserve species at risk and biodiversity in this context? So we worked with a broad-based core planning team to develop the action plan, co-chaired by myself and Monica Hatter at the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. We had representation from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada and Fisheries and Oceans Canada, a variety of provincial governments, industry organizations, conservation organizations, an academic, 2 Indigenous advisors, and 2 producers. And our mandate was to develop this plan by enhancing collaboration, aiming for multi-species and ecosystem-based approaches, developing, our targets, goals, threats, etc., balancing environmental, industry, and community expectations, all of which are very high, building this strategic policy case, and recognizing and building upon existing stewardship activities. And I think that's a really important element to the work, and then developing a path forward for implementation. So this slide, we call this our journey map, and it shows the progress of the work. And let's see if I can, is it going to let me? No, I don't have my highlighter here. But starting with a scoping meeting in November of 2019, and then bringing the core planning team together to start meeting in June of 2020, all the way through to this summer, where we are engaging on the plan, finalizing it, and aiming for endorsement at the end of the summer. So the core planning team developed a vision of agricultural landscapes across Canada that support thriving populations of species at risk, migratory birds, and culturally significant species, through mutual respect and collaboration between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, conservation efforts, resulting in a stronger, more resilient agriculture sector to the benefit and pride of all Canadians. And so our purpose was to develop this plan encompassing all of the agricultural landscapes across Canada. And so this is a map showing the agricultural landscapes across Canada, divided into individual landscapes, which are, where agriculture is taking place within the ecozones of Canada. And within this landscape, we identified 203 species at risk and migratory birds where we considered that there was a high opportunity to address their needs by working with the agriculture sector. And then identified those agriculture-related activities that put pressure on the species. And we ranked those pressures by the number of species that were impacted by each pressure across each of the landscapes. So this is, for those of you that are familiar with the Open Standards for the Practice of Conservation, which is the approach that we were taking to this planning process, this is a slightly different approach to ranking pressures. But it was based on a recognition that the role of the priority sectors initiatives is really to try and benefit as many species as possible. And so we wanted to look at these pressures based on the number of species that were impacted by them. And so the 5 priority pressures that we identified were native grassland and shrubland conversion, tame grassland conversion to arable crops, wetland loss and degradation, disruptive livestock access, and disruptive pesticide application and spills. And in order to identify sort of where we should be working, what we should be focusing on, and how to measure our progress, we took advantage of an enormous piece of work that Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada had already undertaken to identify land use classes through the wildlife habitat capacity indicator that they have developed for monitoring progress under the conservation and biological diversity. And they very kindly worked with us to modify to take that same data and apply a lens of the species that were on our list for which they had data, and looking at their use of breeding habitat as an indicator for habitat capacity. And then we were able to use this information to rate each target landscape quantitatively in terms of its current state and trend in habitat capacity. And the value of that approach is that it's a robust pre-existing data set that spans from 2020 to the present. We're just waiting for from 2000 to the present. We're just waiting for the 2020 data to be publicly released, and will continue to be collected into the future. So it will allow us to monitor over time our progress. And making use of this data, so with the lens of species at risk and migratory birds of conservation concern, looking at breeding habitat, this is an example of the current state and trend that we found. And so this is looking at the prairie pothole target landscape, showing that the median current state is poor, but of course there's still lots of areas of good and very good in there. And there's a declining trend of species potential at a rate of minus 0.06 per year, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it ends up reflecting a lot of habitat, and it's an ongoing trend since 2000. And just for comparison's sake, here's another example of one of our other target landscapes, which is the Mixedwood Plain. So the median is fair. Again, there's still some large areas of good and a few small areas of very good, and also a declining trend of minus 0.07 per year. The other thing we were able to do with this data set was get an understanding of what's actually driving the status and trend. And this is primarily driven by loss of native grassland, tame grass, wetland, and forest. So those were selected as our priority nested targets within the agricultural landscapes. From there, we set goals for the amount and trend of each of those 4 habitat categories: native grassland, tame grass, wetland, and forest, within each of the agricultural landscapes. Based on our understanding and recognizing this is prior to COP15, but we knew what Canada's position was going into COP15, and we knew what the minister's mandate letter said, and so we based our goals on that understanding, recognizing that these particular 4 habitat types are our opportunity to meet the needs of the species. And the other thing that I'll mention about that is that habitat really is the lever that agriculture has to address the needs of species at risk. They can't, producers can't really determine whether or not a particular species is going to show up on their land, but they manage habitat. And so the goals that we came up with, that we agreed to, which are we see now consistent with the new global biodiversity framework, are that by 2030 we would reduce the rate of loss to zero of native grassland, tame grass, wetland, and forest in each agri-landscape, and that by 2050 the overall habitat capacity indicator for these species in the agricultural landscapes would have improved relative to 2015. Now, we know that these are very ambitious goals. And it was very interesting when we were having the conversation about whether or not to move forward with these goals, that there was a common sense among the people, speaking about it in the meetings, that these goals were both perhaps too ambitious, but also not ambitious enough. Very, very hard to accomplish, but perhaps not acting fast enough for the needs of species at risk. And so, I found it very interesting hearing exactly the same people say, an individual person saying both of those things. This is impossible and it's not good enough. But it is consistent with the goals in the Global Biodiversity Framework. And so it presents us with an opportunity to say to Canada, if we were to meet those goals, this is what it would look like. We can go into a bit more detail in the document about exactly what that looks like numerically, understanding that we don't have the 2020 data yet, so it's not as accurate as we would like it to be at this point. But the real question is, how are we going to meet these goals? And so the team came up with a broad range of conservation measures to achieve the goals, which we have roughly categorized in terms of whether or not they are Indigenous related, and the team did not feel that it was their purview to prioritize those measures, that's up to Indigenous peoples. And then we identified focal strategies, which were those strategies that were really exciting to the team, that people voted on as being the ones that they felt were going to be the most effective and feasible. And then supporting strategies that are necessary to ensure the success of the focal strategies. The other endorsed strategies are often those strategies that, maybe they're the purview of a specific organization that's either already agreed to undertake them, and we're just saying, yeah, good on you, keep going, or that we think should be the purview of a specific organization, such as the federal government, for example. And then a few strategies that people felt that at this time, we were less confident that they were feasible or effective, but that could change in the future, and so we didn't want to lose that information. So I'm going to talk mostly for the rest of this talk about the focal conservation measures. And these are really about enabling the agriculture sector to benefit species at risk and biodiversity. So the first set of these measures are measures related to financial incentives of various kinds, to do with payment for ecosystem services, native grassland restoration, private land conservation efforts, restoring functional wetlands, and maintaining and managing tame grasslands. Then there's a focal measure around education programs, and some of the key elements of that are, peer-based education tailored to a regional context, with capacity and with funding tied to implementing best practices. And we know, again, these are examples, we know that there's a lot of programs out there already. So it's how do we scale them up? How do we support them? How do we make sure that there's some national standards, perhaps? Facilitating implementation uptake of integrated pest management. And I know that there's a lot of controversy about even what that term means. And we have a number of supporting measures around ensuring that this will be an effective measure for improving outcomes for species at risk. And then measures around policy and regulations. So looking for perverse incentives and trade-offs, removing incentives that promote conversion, creating disincentives, and working on developing a market pull. And it really is quite interesting to see how a bunch of this language has shown up in the global biodiversity framework. And then finally, strengthening legislation and policy for better conservation of wetlands, retention of tame and native grassland on crown lands leased for agriculture, and taking a landscape scale approach to land protection policies. And I know that there's a lot of anxiety as soon as we start talking about regulation, but I think it's really important to know that regulation has a place, and it's not always a punitive place. It's not always about thou shalt not. It can also be about how do we enable. And so those are some of the things that we need to be looking at. This next slide is just an overview of the supporting measures. So a bunch of measures around improving understanding of the value of habitats, supporting policies and programs, research and development of tools for decision making, and supporting partnerships and collaborations. So our next steps, our comment period is coming to a close. We had sort of two stages to the comment period, where the document was sent out, in English to producers, to members of, to agricultural organizations around mid to late April, and they were given an opportunity to comment until I think it was the 5th of June, and then we had a second round where it was sent out to conservation organizations, and the French translation was sent out to partners, and the close for the comment period for those folks who received the document late is the 20th of June. And so then we'll be spending the summer going through those comments, working with core planning to decide how to address them, finalizing a draft, and bringing it forward to the federal, provincial, and territorial wildlife directors, CWDC, in the fall of 2023 for endorsement, and we hope recommendation to move it up to ADMs and DMs. So if you're interested in getting a copy of that finalized draft and getting involved in implementation, which we will be, we're starting to work on exactly figuring out what that's going to look like, please reach out to me, and we can get you set up, and we welcome any organization that wants to help us with the implementation of the various measures in this plan. So I'm gonna stop it there. And I am open to any questions or discussion.
Everybody, if you'd like to ask a question, you can either raise your hand or type it in the chat box, and we'll get to you in order. Thank you. Go ahead, Chris.
Hi, Carolyn. Thanks for that. I'm glad to see all the work on it. Had a question, just your last slide there mentioned endorsement by wildlife directors. Given that it's focused on the ag sector, will there be a similar request for endorsement from agricultural ministries?
In part, the answer to that question will be up to the wildlife directors. At this point, what we have asked them, because we've been briefing them all along, is that they reach out to their agriculture counterparts within their own governments and ensure that their input to the plan and endorsement of it is supported by their partner agriculture organizations.
Okay, thank you.
No other questions or comments?
Go ahead, Chad.
On the one slide you had about conserving tame grasslands, and I understand what the objective is there, but at the same time, I think you might be hurting livestock producers by doing that, because land costs are one of our biggest factors right now in cost of production. And if we're not able to increase the yield on old stands, that makes us less profitable, which will ultimately hurt your outcome. So I'd just be cautious on regulating people on not being able to replace or rejuvenate tame grass.
So the intent here is not to regulate people, it's to help improve understanding of how to conserve those grasslands, and what measures one can take to perhaps rejuvenate them without plowing, or when it's possible to increase our joint knowledge of how to manage them in a way that is beneficial to species at risk. So it's working with the sectors and the landowners to see what we can do to address loss of tame grass when in circumstances where it's not necessary. But certainly appreciate your input on that, and we welcome those who have knowledge around those issues to be involved in the implementation.
We do have a question from Roderick. Are you planning on using new tech, AI, to help with analysis and then predict outcomes into the future?
Well, that sounds like a cool idea, and I'd like to learn more about it. I know that Ag Canada is involved in making use of a variety of new tech to improve our understanding of what's actually happening on the landscape. But I've not been involved in discussions around predicting outcomes into the future. So be very interested to learn more.
Go ahead, Jim.
Yeah, thanks. No, that was great. I know in talking with Robin Bloom, the idea, when I think of species at risk, I often think of species, not ecosystems. And so I'm excited to see the inclusion of all the habitats as well, in our case, especially the wetlands. And, there are a number of programs going on in the Prairie pothole region that we'd like to engage with you on and get involved with you. It's very, very good to see you. I just want to make a comment more than anything, and look forward to catching up with you.
All right, that's
Thank
great.
you.
Thank you, Jim.
second here. This is just a reply to somebody. Well, there don't appear to be any more sort of pressing questions. If you do have questions going forward, please feel free to contact John, and he can forward them to Carolyn directly, or Carolyn you can also reply to her email address as well. That was on the last slide. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Carolyn for her excellent presentation today, and we look forward to seeing you in future PHJV webinars. To answer the question, yes, this presentation will be available on the PHJV YouTube channel. And there's one more question that just came in. How will we know if things are working or not going forward?
Yeah, so thank you for that question, Roderick. So the intention is to use the data set from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, which is collected on, they call it a semi-decadal basis, so every 5 years, to see overall whether or not we're reaching our goals. And then, you know, the question arises, well, is it because we didn't implement it or didn't implement enough? Or are there other factors in there? So we're still working on the question of, you know, how the governance of the implementation will unfold over time. But certainly we do have, you know, a means at least to measure what is happening into the future. And I think that's going to be very, very helpful. And, you know, we encourage all interested organizations to, you know, pick up the report when it's final, look for those elements that are, you know, in line with your organization's goals and objectives, mission, and do what you can to support the implementation.
And there was one final question not related to the presentation being available on the PHJV webinar channel on YouTube. Can you share the slide deck?
Yes, I don't think there's any reason we couldn't share the slide deck itself. It has been shared from other presentations as well. Would we do that through you, Ian, or
send it to John, and John will forward it out to the group.
Okay.
Again, thank you everybody for attending this month's edition of the PHJV webinar series. Thank you, Carolyn, for your excellent presentation, and we look forward to seeing everybody in our next edition of the webinar series.
Have a great day, everybody. Take care. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.